The afternoon sun blazes over the South China Sea on April 12, 1945, turning the water below into hammered silver that makes depth perception difficult and threats easy to miss until they are already attacking. Lieutenant Robert Chennault guides his P-47 Thunderbolt westward from a fighter sweep over occupied Hainan Island, flying alone after his wingman aborted with engine trouble 40 miles back, leaving him to complete the patrol solo in airspace, where Japanese fighters operate with increasing desperation as their situation deteriorates. The tactical situation is routine enough. Lone American fighter returning from patrol, vulnerable but not helpless, more likely to encounter nothing than to face serious opposition. Then his peripheral vision catches the glint of canopies, 4 aircraft diving from altitude, where they have been waiting, stalking, positioning themselves for the kind of coordinated bounce that doctrine says a lone pilot cannot survive against multiple opponents. The 4 fighters are not the second-line aircraft that Japanese forces increasingly field as losses mount and replacements dwindle. They are late-model Ki-84 Hayates, among the most capable fighters Japan produced, flown by pilots whose smooth formation discipline and textbook positioning announce experience and skill. Chennault has perhaps 15 seconds before they close to firing range, 15 seconds to decide how to respond when American tactical doctrine is unambiguous. A lone fighter engaged by multiple opponents should run if faster, dive if able. Accept combat only as last resort, because coordination and numbers provide advantages that individual skill cannot overcome. But Chennault does not run or dive or prepare for desperate defensive combat. Instead, he does something his squadron mates have mocked as ridiculous, a maneuver they insist violates basic principles of energy management and situational awareness, a technique he calls the wing dip oscillation that seems to accomplish nothing except making his own aircraft harder to control while providing no tactical advantage anyone can identify. What happens during the next 6 minutes will demonstrate that sometimes the most effective tactical innovation is the one opponents cannot understand, because it makes no sense according to the doctrine they learned. Will prove that outthinking enemy aces matters more than outflying them, when thinking differently creates confusion that converts their coordination into liability, and will force the same pilots who ridiculed the wing dip move to acknowledge that occasionally the ridiculous is simply the innovative viewed by minds too conventional to recognize how unconventional approaches might work. To understand why Chennault believed that deliberately inducing oscillation in his aircraft would help him survive against 4 experienced opponents, one must first comprehend what American fighter doctrine in 1945 taught about maintaining energy state, and why that doctrine was simultaneously correct in general and potentially wrong in specific circumstances. The physics of air combat by 1945 were well understood. Altitude converted to speed through diving, speed converted to altitude through climbing. Turning bled energy that could not be recovered without time and space, that combat rarely provided. Successful fighter pilots managed their energy state continuously, avoided maneuvers that sacrificed speed without corresponding advantage, maintained awareness of their aircraft's performance envelope, and stayed within it. The P-47 Thunderbolt, while heavy and not particularly maneuverable compared to lighter fighters, excelled at high-altitude performance and could dive faster than almost anything it might face. Standard doctrine for P-47 pilots facing superior numbers was explicit. Use speed and altitude advantage to dictate engagement terms, make high-speed passes rather than turning fights, disengage when opponents attempted to force sustained maneuvering that would negate American advantages. This doctrine was sound, was based on analysis of thousands of combat engagements, had saved countless pilots who followed its principles rather than attempting individual innovations that usually got them killed. Chennault had come to fighter aviation through family heritage that shaped his thinking about air combat in ways that formal training did not address. His father was Claire Chennault, the legendary commander of the Flying Tigers who had developed fighter tactics for the P-40 Warhawk in China during the early war years, whose tactical innovations had allowed inferior aircraft to compete successfully against Japanese fighters that were faster and more maneuverable on paper. Robert Chennault had grown up hearing his father discuss the difference between fighting according to doctrine and fighting according to circumstance, had internalized the principle that tactical doctrine provided general guidance, but that specific situations often required approaches doctrine did not cover. When he analyzed how multiple fighters coordinated their attacks, he noticed something interesting. They relied on predictability. The lead attacker approached from the optimal angle, while wingmen positioned themselves to engage if the target maneuvered in expected ways. If the target dove, someone was positioned below. If the target turned, someone was positioned to cut him off. The coordination was impressive and effective precisely because it anticipated how targets would respond, positioned attackers to cover those responses, made escape nearly impossible when executed by experienced pilots. The wing-dip oscillation that Chennault developed was brutally simple in execution and deceptively complex in its effects. Rather than maintaining stable flight or executing conventional maneuvers, he would roll his aircraft approximately 30 degrees left, hold that bank angle for 2 seconds, roll through level to 30 degrees right, hold for 2 seconds, repeat continuously while maintaining generally straight flight. The oscillation made his aircraft wander across perhaps 500 feet of lateral space, created a weaving pattern that was neither evasive maneuvering nor straight-line flight, but something in between. To observers watching from friendly aircraft, the maneuver looked like a pilot struggling to maintain control, like someone overcorrecting for turbulence or fighting with trim settings. Squadron mates who had watched Chennault practice the technique told him he looked drunk, that he was wasting energy on pointless maneuvering, that making his aircraft harder to control served no tactical purpose they could identify. The criticism reflected conventional understanding of air combat. You wanted your aircraft stable and responsive, wanted to maintain maximum energy state, wanted to present the smallest possible turning radius when maneuvering was necessary. Deliberate oscillation achieved none of these objectives and seemed to make the aircraft more difficult to fly without corresponding benefit. The theory behind the wing-dip oscillation that made Chennault persist despite mockery was based on disrupting predictability rather than maximizing performance. Attacking fighters coordinated by predicting where the target would be when they reached firing range, by positioning themselves to intercept the target's flight path, by timing their approaches so that the target faced threats from multiple angles simultaneously. But prediction required extrapolating current flight path into future position, and extrapolation assumed the target maintained generally constant heading and altitude. If the target oscillated unpredictably, if it wandered across lateral space in patterns that were neither random nor purposeful, prediction became difficult. Attackers approaching from different angles would find their carefully coordinated positioning disrupted because the target was not where it should be, was offset by amounts that seemed small but that made firing solutions impossible to establish, that required attackers to adjust their approaches in ways that destroyed the timing that made coordination effective. The oscillation was not evasive maneuvering. It was too slow and predictable for that. but rather a subtle disruption of the predictability that enemy coordination relied upon. The sound of the P-47's Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine became the symbolic element that defined what the wingdip oscillation represented, that deep, powerful rumble of 18 cylinders producing over 2,000 horsepower, a sound that characterized the Thunderbolt's strength and reliability, that remained constant and steady, even as the aircraft rolled left and right in the deliberate oscillation that seemed purposeless to observers. That sound was what separated the oscillation from desperate maneuvering, was what announced that the pilot was in control, rather than fighting for control, was what made the technique calculated, rather than panicked. For the Japanese pilots approaching to attack, the sound they could not hear but whose effects they would experience was the sound of tactical thinking that violated their assumptions about how lone American fighters would respond to coordinated attacks. The engagement began at 14:37 hours when the 4 Ki-84s completed their dive from altitude and began their attack sequence. The lead fighter, approaching from Chennault's 7 o'clock high position, while the 3 wingmen positioned themselves to cover the probable escape routes. Standard coordination, executed smoothly, should have provided at least one fighter with a firing solution, regardless of how the target maneuvered. Chennault initiated the wingdip oscillation immediately, rolling left 30 degrees as the lead Ki-84 began its firing pass. The Japanese pilot, expecting his target to either maintain heading or brake hard into the attack, found his carefully calculated approach disrupted by the target being 200 feet left of where it should have been. He adjusted, rolled to follow, but the adjustment cost him airspeed, and the target had rolled back right by the time he reestablished his sight picture. His firing pass produced no hits, the rounds passing through space where the P-47 had been rather than where it was, and he overshot without achieving the kill his positioning should have guaranteed. The second Ki-84, positioned to intercept, if Chennault broke right, found itself in the wrong position when the oscillation put the P-47 left of its predicted flight path. The pilot adjusted, turning to re-engage, but the oscillation had destroyed the timing that made coordinated attacks effective. Instead of facing 4 threats arriving nearly simultaneously from different angles, Chennault faced 4 threats arriving sequentially, each pilot forced to adjust his approach to account for the oscillation that put the target where it was not supposed to be. The transformation from coordinated attack to sequential engagement changed the mathematics fundamentally. 4 fighters attacking simultaneously made escape nearly impossible. 4 fighters attacking one after another made survival possible, because only one threat needed to be managed at any given moment, because the time between attacks allowed the target to maintain awareness and respond to each threat individually. The Japanese pilots, recognizing their initial coordination had failed, attempted to regroup and establish a new attack pattern, but the oscillation continued, the P-47 rolling left and right in that maddening pattern that was too slow to be evasive maneuvering, but too disruptive to ignore, that kept their carefully planned approaches from working as doctrine said they should. Flight leader Takeo Shibata, leading the Ki-84 element, would describe the engagement in his after-action report, preserved in Japanese naval archives, his frustration evident even through the formal language. The American aircraft flew in an oscillating pattern that made prediction of its flight path impossible. We adjusted our attacks repeatedly, but could not establish coordinated firing solutions because the target was never where standard doctrine indicated it would be. The oscillation was not violent enough to be considered evasive maneuvering, was not random enough to be loss of control, but rather appeared to be deliberate technique we had not encountered previously. After 6 minutes of engagement, during which we achieved only superficial hits, despite numerical superiority and favorable positioning, we disengaged due to fuel constraints. The transformation visible in how the engagement unfolded was that Chenault had converted superior enemy numbers and coordination into liability rather than advantage. The 4 Japanese pilots, all experienced aces with multiple confirmed kills, found their training and skill irrelevant because the situation they faced did not match the situations their doctrine had prepared them for. They knew how to coordinate attacks against targets that flew predictably, knew how to position themselves to cut off escape routes, knew how to sequence their firing passes so that the target faced continuous threat. But the wingdip oscillation disrupted every element of that coordination by introducing just enough unpredictability that prediction became impossible without introducing so much unpredictability that the target became impossible to track. The result was that skilled pilots with superior numbers achieved inferior results, not because they executed poorly, but because the tactical problem they faced was one their doctrine had not addressed and their experience had not prepared them to solve. The critical insight that made the wingdip oscillation effective was that it exploited how human brains process prediction and adjust to disruption. When pilots coordinated attacks, they subconsciously calculated where the target would be based on its current flight path, positioned themselves to intercept that predicted position, timed their approaches to arrive when the target would be vulnerable. Those calculations happened rapidly, drawing on training and experience, allowing skilled pilots to position themselves with precision. But the calculations assumed the target would continue its current flight path, would not suddenly be offset by several hundred feet without executing maneuvers dramatic enough to be recognized as evasive action. The oscillation was slow enough that pilots did not recognize it as evasive maneuvering. It did not trigger the tactical responses they had trained for, but disruptive enough that their predictions were consistently wrong. By the time they recognized the pattern and adjusted their calculations to account for oscillation, Chenault had changed the oscillation frequency or amplitude, making the new predictions wrong as well. The technique forced attacking pilots into continuous adjustment cycles, where they were always reacting to what the target had done rather than predicting what it would do, where their coordination degraded because coordination required prediction, and prediction had become impossible. The resistance Chenault encountered when he attempted to explain the wingdip oscillation to other squadron pilots reflected how difficult it was to articulate why something that looked ridiculous actually worked. The technique violated conventional wisdom about energy management, oscillating wasted energy that could be used for maneuvering. It violated conventional wisdom about situational awareness. Rolling back and forth made it harder to maintain visual contact with threats. It violated conventional wisdom about aircraft control. Deliberately inducing instability made the aircraft harder to fly, precisely when precision mattered most. Every criticism was valid according to established doctrine, and pilots who raised those criticisms were not wrong to question whether benefits outweighed costs. What made the technique effective was that it operated in a space between conventional categories, not evasive enough to be maneuvering, not stable enough to be straight flight, not random enough to be loss of control, not predictable enough to be countered by adjustment. That in-between character was precisely what made opponents unable to respond effectively, because their training had prepared them to handle conventional threats, but not unconventional approaches that did not fit doctrinal categories. The 4 Japanese aces who disengaged after 6 minutes without achieving the kill their positioning and numbers should have guaranteed returned to their base, confused and frustrated, reporting an engagement that made no sense according to their understanding of air combat tactics. Their squadron commander, reviewing the gun camera footage and listening to their accounts, initially suspected they were covering for poor execution rather than reporting accurately about an American tactical innovation. The suggestion that a lone P-47 had evaded 4 coordinated Ki-84s, not through superior speed or maneuvering, but through deliberate oscillation that disrupted prediction, seemed implausible enough that it was more reasonable to assume the attacking pilots had made mistakes they were reluctant to acknowledge. Only when similar reports came from other units, all describing American fighters that oscillated in ways that made coordinated attacks ineffective, did Japanese tactical analysts recognize that they were facing a technique their doctrine had not prepared them to counter. The transformation in how American fighter squadrons evaluated unconventional tactics following Chennault's successful demonstration of the wingdip oscillation was gradual and incomplete. Officially, the technique was never incorporated into formal training because it violated too many established principles and because explaining why it worked required understanding that most pilots did not possess or were not interested in developing. The mechanics were simple enough. Anyone could roll an aircraft left and right, but the timing, amplitude, and variation required to make the technique effective rather than just disruptive to one's own aircraft required practice and judgment that resisted codification. Squadron commanders who attempted to include the oscillation in training curricula found that most pilots either executed it so poorly that it provided no benefit or became so focused on maintaining the oscillation that they lost situational awareness and made themselves more vulnerable rather than less. The technique worked for pilots who understood why they were doing it and who could maintain awareness while executing it, but it failed for pilots who treated it as a mechanical procedure to be followed rather than a tactical approach to be adapted to circumstances. The sound of that Pratt & Whitney R-2800 during those 6 minutes, that steady rumble that remained constant while the aircraft rolled left and right in deliberate oscillation, became the audible representation of what separated tactical innovation from tactical desperation. Desperate pilots maneuvered violently, their engine sounds fluctuating as power settings changed, as structural loads mounted, as control became negotiation between pilot intent and aircraft capability. Chennault's engine note remained steady throughout because the oscillation was controlled, because he was flying the aircraft rather than fighting it, because the technique was calculated rather than instinctive. That steady rumble announced to anyone listening, which included the Japanese pilots close enough to hear, but focused too intently on attacking to process what they heard, that the oscillating P-47 was being flown deliberately, that what looked like struggling for control was actually control being used unconventionally, that the ridiculous was actually innovative when understood correctly. The 6 minutes during which Chennault held off 4 Japanese aces using a technique his squadron mates called ridiculous were 6 minutes during which conventional tactical wisdom proved inadequate for unconventional situations. The wingdip oscillation worked not because it was superior to conventional evasive maneuvering, but because it created a problem attacking pilots were not prepared to solve, because it disrupted coordination that relied on prediction, because it forced experienced opponents into continuous adjustment cycles that prevented them from using their experience effectively. The 4 Japanese pilots were not inferior aviators. They were skilled professionals flying capable aircraft with numerical superiority and favorable positioning. They failed to achieve their objective not because they executed poorly, but because the tactical problem they faced was one their training had not addressed, because their doctrine assumed targets would either fly predictably or maneuver in recognizable ways, because the space between those categories was where Chinook operated and where their coordination became liability rather than advantage. And so we returned to that blazing afternoon over the South China Sea, to Lieutenant Chinook alone at altitude, with 4 Ki-84s diving to attack, to the 15 seconds between detecting threat and deciding response when doctrine says run and instinct says fight. But calculation says something else entirely. The wingdip oscillation that follows, that deliberate rolling left and right that makes squadron mates watching from distance shake their heads and mutter about ridiculous techniques that accomplish nothing useful, is the physical manifestation of thinking differently about tactical problems that conventional doctrine addresses inadequately. The steady rumble of the R-2800 throughout, the sound that never wavers even as the aircraft oscillates, announces that ridiculous and innovative are separated only by whether the technique works, that mockery transforms into respect when unconventional approaches achieve results. Conventional methods cannot, that sometimes the most effective response to coordination and numbers is disruption. Subtle enough that opponents do not recognize it as defensive technique until they have already wasted their advantage, trying to solve a problem their training did not prepare them to address. The 4 Japanese aces returning to base without the kill they expected, confused about how a lone American fighter evaded their coordinated attack, are experiencing what happens when doctrine meets innovation, when conventional skill faces unconventional thinking, when the ridiculous proves itself through survival that probability said should not have occurred. Their confusion is not stupidity or incompetence, but rather the natural response of professionals whose training and experience prove inadequate for situations that fall outside the categories their doctrine defines, whose coordination becomes liability when the target they coordinate against operates in spaces between the predictable and the random, where coordination cannot function effectively. The wing-dip oscillation, mocked and misunderstood and eventually validated through results that made skepticism impossible to maintain, stands as testament to the continuing possibility that tactical innovation emerges not from superior technology or training, but from willingness to question whether conventional approaches are optimal for every situation, from recognizing that doctrine exists to handle common circumstances, but that uncommon circumstances may require ridiculous approaches that work precisely because they are ridiculous enough that opponents have never encountered them and therefore cannot respond effectively. The sound of that engine, steady and powerful throughout the oscillation, is the sound of controlled unconventionality, of deliberate deviation from doctrine, of thinking differently about how to survive when conventional thinking leads to conventional outcomes that in this case would have meant death against superior numbers and coordination. It is the sound that announces the ridiculous can be innovative when conventional innovation has become so thoroughly understood by opponents that conventionality itself becomes predictable and therefore defeats itself. When breaking rules everyone knows creates advantage over those who follow rules everyone expects, when 6 minutes of oscillating flight defeats 6 minutes of coordinated attack, because coordination assumes prediction, and prediction assumes consistency, and consistency is exactly what the oscillation denies to opponents who need it to use their numerical superiority effectively. And in that denial, in those 6 minutes when 4 aces failed to kill 1 pilot, not because they lacked skill, but because he denied them the tactical problem their skill prepared them to solve, lies the truth that outthinking matters more than outflying. When thinking differently creates problems opponents cannot solve with conventional solutions, that the ridiculous and the innovative are distinguished only by results, and that sometimes survival belongs to those willing to appear foolish, if appearing foolish makes opponents confused, and confusion, when multiplied across 4 attackers attempting coordination, adds up to the only advantage that matters, the advantage of still being alive when the engagement ends and fuel constraints force disengagement. And the ridiculous technique proves itself through the simple fact that its practitioner flies home, while his critics must acknowledge that perhaps ridiculous was simply a word, meaning innovative when viewed by minds too conventional to recognize innovation until it succeeds in ways conventional approaches cannot.